Are you searching for the best in online black radio? Then go to blacktalkradionetwork.com, helping you filter through the noise. Real talk, black talk.
Good afternoon. After 13 years, the family of Christopher Older have received a landmark apology from the government. It's agreed to pay compensation to the family of the former soldier who collapsed and died at a police station in Hull in 1998. In a moment, I'll be speaking to a legal expert who's been representing them. But first, our correspondent Vicky Johnson has the background to the case.
For the past 13 years, Janet Older's been conducting a relentless campaign to find out more about how her brother Christopher died in police custody. The 37-year-old former paratrooper had been involved in a fight in 1998. He was taken first to hospital and then to the custody suite at Queen's Gardens Police Station, where CCTV pictures captured the moment he died.
This could happen to my son, and for me to believe that I could never, ever do anything about it I couldn't stand that.
5 officers were charged back in 1999 with misconduct, but the trial was postponed until after the inquest, which happened in 2000, when the jury decided Christopher had been killed unlawfully. As a result, 5 Humberside police officers were charged with manslaughter, but during their trial in 2002, those charges were dropped and they were cleared of all offences. The following year, all 5 officers were cleared after facing disciplinary action. But finally, Humberside Police did apologise in 2006 after an inquiry by the newly formed Independent Police Complaints Commission strongly criticised the independence and effectiveness of the previous investigations.
The time is therefore right for me publicly to apologise to Christopher Older's family for our failure to treat Christopher with sufficient compassion and to the desired standard that night.
Today's unprecedented apology from the government comes just weeks after it was revealed that Christopher's body is still lying in a Hull mortuary, despite his very public funeral 11 years ago. Vicky Johnson, BBC Look North.
Well, I'm joined now by Karina Ferguson from the human rights organisation Liberty. Now, you've been representing the Older family. What does this outcome mean for them?
Well, this is the first time that the family have had a formal recognition from the state that the state authorities as a whole let them down in failing to hold anyone accountable for Christopher's death. And that in itself is significant, but it's really appalling that the family had to go to these extraordinary lengths and all this time to get to this point. And it's taken the sheer determination of somebody like Janet to get justice for her brother that's enabled this to happen.
Well, as you said, no one has ever been held accountable for Christopher's death, and that's what the family wanted. So is this apology enough?
I don't think the apology can ever rectify what went wrong here, and the way that Christopher was treated and the failings in the investigation into his death were really deplorable, and nothing can ever compensate or rectify that, but it is at least welcome that finally the family have some acknowledgement at least that the human rights of them and of Christopher were breached in this case, and that was the right to life, the right not to be tortured or treated inhumanely, and the right not to be discriminated against, because there were indicators here that that Christopher's race was a factor in his death.
And how unusual is an apology like this from the government?
As far as we're aware, this is the first time that the government has used this procedure to issue a unilateral declaration, that's what, the technical term for it, in the European Court of Human Rights. And today the European Court has issued a judgment which accepts that declaration and holds that that is then therefore the end of the case. And as I say, as far as we're aware, that's the first time that this procedure has been used in relation to a death in custody in the UK, so it is significant. But I think what we all and the family would like to be reassured of is that this sort of situation could never happen again. And sadly, there is a problem in terms of accountability for deaths in custody in this country, and no police officers have ever been convicted following deaths of this kind.
Karina, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us. Karina Ferguson from the human rights organisation Liberty, representing the Older family. And of course there will be more on that story on Look North at 6:30 tonight.
Context of white supremacy. Justice, Gus T Renegade in for another broadcast, hopefully to share constructive information on the system of white supremacy. Today's date is Monday, June 17th, 2013. So I have been told. This is broadcast number 1 of the day. We are on the counter-racist grind. We will be back in 5 hours. Ross Tuttle, he is a white male, racist suspect. He is a freelance journalist as well as a documentary filmmaker. He's been doing a lot of films on stop and frisk. I think even Stephen Lawrence's brother, Stuart Lawrence, in the UK, has a suit right now where he has been stopped by enforcement officers. I think he said more than 20 times with no justification, where he can only conclude, this is because I'm a black male. But Mr. Tuttle, he's been doing a lot of documentary coverage on black males, non-white people, period, being stopped and frisked unjustly in New York City. He will be with us. He says that the problem is that white people are not aware that black people are having these sorts of troubles and being abused by enforcement officers. I do not agree. Tune in, as I said, that'll be a little later today, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. Before we even get to the program, just a pause to recognize Mr. Christopher Alder. You heard in the sound clip at the beginning of the program, Mr. Christopher Alder, victim of racism, white supremacy. I had no idea who Christopher Alder was. I'd never heard his name before. Didn't know anything about him until I watched a segment. This was on the BBC about, in the past few days, you can watch it online, but they were having a discussion, and it was, are we becoming more racist? And this was since the Woolwich attack last month, where a white male, Lee Rigby, he was killed publicly. The 2 suspects, black males, they have been portrayed as extreme Muslims. They have them on video with bloodied hands, and they hacked this person. That's what they've been accused of doing. And it's just been incredible, the response. The English Defense League, they've been marching and having protests, and you've had just all these mosques have been attacked. It's been a really interesting time. I'm really thankful to do the program. But in this segment on the BBC, a non-white male, I think his name is Akala, he made the point, he said that this is not the first time that we've had a British soldier murdered under suspicious circumstances, on video even. They have video footage of Christopher Alder in custody with his pants lowered, and the officers abusing him and what have you. British soldier treated this way. And then just to add to the humiliation of it all, they mix up the body. You can't even do a proper, just disgusting. And I saw a report where they said that they had at least 10 opportunities to catch this error, that they, gave out the incorrect body, and they didn't do anything. At any rate, I am thrilled about the program today. Our guest, she has easily been one of our favorite visitors. She has just a wealth of fantastic information, and it's always a treat to hear from her. She is an internationally acclaimed reparationist. Also will be wonderful timing to hear her thoughts on what's been going down with the compensation to Kenyan victims of racism. She's also a jurisconsult, a dynamic community advocate, and radio broadcaster for Voice of Africa Radio. She serves as the co-vice chair of the Pan-African Reparations Coalition in Europe, PARCO, and definitely want to encourage folks to check her out at Voice of Africa Radio. Should be linked with the program. Always a pleasure to have her on the program. We are eternally grateful to Mr. Leo Muhammad for encouraging us to have her on the broadcast. Joining us for the third time, our guest, Mrs. Esther Stanford Xosei. Mrs. Xosei, are you with us?
I am. Greetings.
Greetings. Thank you so much again for sharing some of your Monday evening with us. It is always just fantastic to have you on the program. Just for our listeners, this might be their first time hearing from you. Anything you think folks should know about you before we get started?
I think you've kind of covered a very good summary of the kind of work that I'm about. I guess primarily I would say my work is around reparations, which is simply repairing the damage as a result of, enslavement and colonialism and their shared legacies that our people continue to experience worldwide. And so all of my work really is an attempt to affect reparations, the internal aspects of our self-repairs that we need to make and embark on as a people.
Outstanding. We're going to bring this back up once we get to the portion talking about the compensation for the Mau Mau abuses. And can you just keep that in mind for that part of the discussion, listeners? Before we get to what happened with Woolwich, did you have any thoughts on Christopher Alder, the clip that we began with?
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm not surprised you haven't heard of the case. And actually, there are other cases that are equally, I think, noteworthy. But this is particularly significant because of this declaration where there was some kind of acknowledgement of wrongdoing. However, I feel that it's unfortunate that families have to go down this path of trying to hold governments accountable for individual deaths when what's happening to us is happening, to us as a people. So I do feel that we need to, as commendable as this landmark judgment has been, we also need to move to group action. Because, the amount of resources it takes, financial, human, material, and otherwise, for families to keep fighting these individual cases when we're dealing with systemic oppression, which can only be tackled collectively.
Wow. Can you give our listeners an idea of what that would look like as opposed to these individual efforts to correct?
Yes. I mean, if we had several families coming together and sort of waging a class action, as opposed to looking at what happened to individual family members. If this was a class action that was even waged on the basis of a genocide, for instance, utilizing international law, human rights law, and people's rights law, to actually launch a legal action, an extra legal action that actually goes beyond individuals but looks at communities of harm. Because when a Christopher Alder is killed, it's not just himself that we need to look at in terms of compensation to families and so forth. It's also about the damage that is caused to the family members and the loved ones who are also maimed, who are also victimized by these family killings. And so I do feel we need to evolve our legal and political strategies that can recognize that victims are not just the individuals who may be attacked or killed or whatever it may be. The victims extend to their family members and their loved ones and their dependents. And we need to evolve strategies that can encompass remedies for the full range of victims.
I have 2 quick points before we get to the Woolwich. Number one, you have quite a bit of legal expertise. Your work with reparations as well. You are a jurisconsult. You have been liberally using the term victims. It's been my experience that many black people do not like to think of themselves as victims. They do not want to be referenced as victims. I just wanted you to respond to that and why you continue.
I mean, sure. I think it's not only our people. There's a lot of people who have a problem with the term victims, but I was using it in a kind of specific legal context, which basically it's the category of people who are affected by the various acts of harm and wrongdoing that we're talking about, the various crimes that we're talking about. Yes, the term victim can be a term that is considered to be pejorative because it denies agency, it implies as though people are powerless and so forth. And so I can understand a reluctance to identify with the label of being a victim. However, I do feel that it's not so much about being a victim. A victim status also provides an opportunity for one to remain a victim and victimized, or for one to raise their level of consciousness to actually transform a victim status to a status where one is actually actively engaged in the struggle for emancipation and liberation. So I'm using it in a very specific legal context. However, I do feel that it's not a term necessarily that we have to totally abandon, because it's how we recognize that someone has been wronged, and that's just the kind of standard terminology. It doesn't mean it can't change, but it's not so much about being a victim. It's more, how we use a victim status to actually wake ourselves up to our reality of oppression, in order that we can do something about it and seek to change it.
Phenomenal. Oh, that is music to my ears. I'm going to say that from now on. When any time a discussion of that term comes up, it's how we recognize someone has been wronged. Oh,
yes. Because yes, we don't want to make it look as though we're just so downtrodden and we're so oppressed and we can't do anything about it. So I do understand the critique of it, because words do have power, because they convey concepts. The problem would only remain is if we accepted a victim status rather than use that as a springboard to actually wake us up, to actually change that reality. But if we deny that harm and wrongdoing is actually being perpetrated against us, then how do we even enlighten or awaken ourselves to this reality? And I'm talking about not just the individual selves, but our collective selves, our community members, who oftentimes are victimized daily in their work, in all kinds of daily assaults, microaggressions as they're called. But it's become so normalized that even terms like racism are actually beginning to lose their meaning.
Absolutely. I just want people to keep in mind, it for me is 12 noon, a little bit after 12 noon. For Miss Stanford Xosei, it is a little after 8 p.m. That's how far apart we are, but it seems like we have a very similar experience with racism, white supremacy, world system.
Well, it is a global system, as you said. It might have its local dimensions, but when we kind of put it all together, we realize there's a lot of similarities in how this system operates, both at home and abroad.
Amen. Would it be accurate? You are a victim of racism, white supremacy? Is that an accurate statement?
I would say that I have been victimized by white supremacy racism because I live in a system where that is very much a reality. However, I actually choose to do something with that victimization, and hence my being a committed social justice activist and reparations activist who's really seeking to engage in forms of activism that can bring about change, progressive social change.
Is there precedence when you were talking about groups of families getting together for a class action suit? Is there precedence of that?
There are I believe in other jurisdictions in the United States. There are some precedents. In the UK, it's not very well utilized. I mean, it has been utilized in civil law jurisdictions, say around consumer actions and so forth, but we haven't yet seen it being utilized within the criminal law or around, negligence or unlawful killing and so forth, in particular around deaths in custody, even though there are campaign groups. So there is a group called the United Friends and Families Campaign, where a lot of the families of those who have been killed in police, prison and psychiatric custody come together under this banner of the United Friends and Family Campaign. However, what you see within that campaign is still very much individual campaigns, individual family campaigns. And where we need to move to is, as I've said before, the collective campaigns and strategies. But I believe that is happening. That is definitely going to happen.
Wow, that is a fantastic concept. I want to think about. I'm going to ask our guest later today, because he does a lot of work around stop and frisk and dealing with victims. I'm going to ask him, see what he thinks about that, because I think that's a great concept.
That's right, because you see, a lot of, obviously, law is also about the will. I mean, I think it was Karl Marx that said law, or something like law is the will of the ruling classes enacted into legislation. So there has been a reluctance, if you like, on the part of the state and those who are enforcers of the law to recognize these collective claims. However, we also know our history of a people in terms of our own emancipation. We have always shaped law. We have been lawmakers, we have been law shapers. We are not just people who have had law negatively imposed upon us, and that's where we have to utilize our own self-determining power to be able to collectively amass the strength and the capacity to challenge the existing laws where they are not fit for purpose. And so that's why I say it can't just be a straight legal approach, it also has to be a political struggle where we can actually ensure that the legal system stretches to accommodate our justice claims.
Again, our guest, Mrs. Esther Stanford Xosei, joining us live from the United Kingdom. Wanted to get to one of the biggest topics of the year so far. May 2013, the death of British soldier Lee Rigby, white male. This was videotaped, pictures, really gruesome footage, two black male suspects. They are in custody with bloodied hands and these machetes and knives and what have you. All around the world, they were showing these images. In fact, it reminded me of the London riots in 2011 when they had the image of the black male. He was, mugging this white male. It was a white teenager in the street, and he was forcing him, they say, to take his pants off. So he had his trousers about halfway down. He was in his boxers. I think he had his shirt off too. They were saying, "Oh my God, this black guy this savage is making him disrobe." And that's what it reminded me of. But this has been a huge incident for about the past month. Can you kind of give us your thoughts on what you saw just the initial reports?
Yes, I mean, it's the Woolwich incident, or Woolwich tragedy, as we in PARCO, the Pan-African Reparations Coalition, have described it. Now, this incident is quite complex because on the one hand there is increasing speculation building that the murder of the British soldier, Lee Rigby, may not be what it appears to be. So there are some, what others would probably call conspiracy theories. There's notions of, well, is this a false flag operation designed to create fear and intimidate the British public around the threat of so-called domestic terrorism or extremism? So there's a whole kind of body of information out there that's challenging some of the official narratives. There's been questions asked around the scene of the so-called incident, things looking a bit too calm, the fact that the two alleged killers seem to commit a particular act, which we're not quite sure what happened. It was initially reported about a beheading, and subsequently there's been less reporting of that. So the facts are not very clear exactly as to how this soldier died. We know that he died, but we cannot say how fully. So yes, there's all those questions that I think are important to ask and to seek answers to, and we don't have full information as yet. There's also been some commentary around the staging, what some are saying appears to be a staging of an incident whereby, this whole notion of men brandishing machetes and cleavers, and the reporting of this savage incident, but yet a white female calmly going to them, speaking to them, seeking to kind of understand their actions and to sort of calm them down, which is quite unusual. I think most young black men probably wouldn't have that experience. I think it's quite the opposite, because we know the typical story of, well, when there's even a group, and the group might even be 2 or 3 young black men, they often feel this sense that other people, especially white females, might find them intimidating. So there's lots of irregularities, inconsistencies, and certainly questions that still need to be answered. However, despite all of these questions, I feel if it is a false flag incident, the truth will come out eventually. But even if it was, I don't feel that's where we need to leave things, because sometimes we can be in danger of saying, yeah, well, could have been an inside job, and then we sit back and do nothing apart from provide commentary. So I feel this situation also requires another response. Whilst we're still trying to ascertain what the actual facts of this situation are. And this other response is a collective community response once again, because whether this incident was a false flag operation, not to say that a soldier wasn't killed, but, if there were unintended or intended casualties as well that went beyond that soldier, we're also feeling that as a community in terms of the implications of this incident for the rest of our people. A lot is being reported about Muslim connections and Islam and so forth, and increasing Islamophobia, and that is a reality. However, what's also not being picked up very well is that the face of Islam, the face of the domestic terrorist and extremist has changed. Because these 2 men were obviously of black men of African heritage, in fact Nigerian heritage, did not look the stereotypical look of what one identifies. And again, it's hard to go beyond these stereotypes sometimes, because that's what the media likes to drum up. But certainly these 2 young men were 2 young men that, we all know. They're the typical looking young black men in our communities. And so in that sense, the perception of who is a Muslim or who is a so-called terrorist, domestic extremist, has then shifted to being the young male of African Caribbean heritage, the young black male, and that's something quite different that's not really being picked up, because even when there's been reporting around Muslims and Islamophobia, there is still a portrayal of Islam as not being something that our community embraces, which isn't correct, because there's a significant amount of people of Muslim background or faith in Africa and across the African diaspora. So it kind of presents a much more complex picture as to identity, the role of faith and belief, so-called religious affiliation, and political Islam and what that represents. And so it means that it's something that we also have to find answers to in terms of the wider black community. What does this mean for us? Because they're not going to look and say, oh no, you're not a Muslim. Actually, we're all being targeted in the same way now.
Wow. This is why I'm just thrilled to have Mrs. Stanford Xosei on the program, because I think that is critical information that she just shared. And in fact, I think this has global implications, because we didn't even cover, I said I got an F in my coverage of the news because I really didn't even pay great attention to what happened in Woolwich that week. I knew about it, but I didn't really go into the fine details, because the incident also happened in Sweden that week, where you had the rioting because they said he was Portuguese. Now, I did have a guest on from Sweden, and he said he wasn't sure if the person was a white person or not. But I did see in the paper, they said, and this was a direct quote, they said if the victim who was shot and killed by the police in Sweden, if he had been Swedish, this wouldn't have happened. Now, just that to me signals this may have been someone who was not white. They tend to say that about about non-white people. You're not British, you're not American, you're not Swedish. That tends to be the way it correlates. But there were so many things that were happening, and they were connected. And I said that when we talked about these incidents before. What happened in Sweden, the rioting, you heard the same thing. Muslims, immigrants, non-white, all codes, non-white people, black people, we're fed up with them. They're not behaving. They're not trying to be Swedish. They're not trying to be British. They're not trying to be American. They're a problem. We need to get rid of them. We need to do something with them. They're criminals, thugs, vagrants. They're a threat. And I think just those images being broadcast around the world of a black guy with bloodied hands, a machete, having killed a white soldier, my Lord.
Who again, when you contrast the imagery, you see lovely pictures of the soldier in the uniform, smiles and everything like that, and it's very idyllic, and obviously you've had the family members, but the portrayal of these two young men who are accused of killing him is something different. And all those negative stereotypes of savagery, initially the press was saying these were foreigners basically, although these appear to be British-born young men. And certainly if you're in the UK, you would pick up the accents, very much London accents, from the street, as it were. So it's very interesting in terms of the perception and the imagery that has been broadcast around the world of these two men, and how that will be interpreted. Basically, the threat now is within. And it's not to say that we were not ever considered a threat, but it's escalated somewhat. It's gone up a notch, simply because of the implications of terrorism. And in fact, that's how it was defined very early. It was defined as being terrorism, although this was the killing, as tragic as it was, of one soldier. And, that's how it was defined. This was terrorism, domestic extremism, and in fact, the Prime Minister, David Cameron, said that it was an attack not only on the British people, but the British way of life. Now, that's quite interesting, given the fact that technically, I guess these two young men can also be classified as British by virtue of citizenship, not nationality or ethnicity, but by virtue perhaps of the passports they hold. So it's also throwing up interesting questions once again as to our status, and how even when many of our people would consider themselves to be British, that we have a British status which is not like the Caucasian in this country.
Wow. Really important, in my opinion. Also, just for additional global context, the same week that all of this happened, the Sweden riots, the death of Lee Rigby, that was also when the accusations about President Obama really picked up his wrongdoing, that we've got these scandals and they're investigating. I think that was the week where they had all sorts of things. The IRS, they're checking into these Republican white groups who are trying to get their tax exempt status. It was a lot of things. Anti-blackness. I think I said that at the beginning of the year, I thought there was going to be a major anti-black campaign, and 6 months in, I would say that is the story of the year worldwide. Specifically because I have been hearing a lot. There have been tons of reports saying that attacks on Muslims have been just exponentially have increased over the past 30 days since these attacks, or it's not even been 30 days, really about 3 weeks since these attacks. I have not seen anything about, are black people feeling attacked? Are black people being mistreated?
And in fact we are, because again the perception and the imagery, and the fact is, certainly in many inner city areas in the UK, we have a significant number of young black men. And in a UK context, the term black doesn't just mean of African origin, or African Caribbean, or African diaspora. It's also a term that some people who are Asian still use in terms of the political definition of black. So that's why I'm always contextualizing it or qualifying it when I use the term black. But what we do know is that a significant amount of young people, especially young men, black men are Muslim. And they are attracted to Islam because Islam appears to offer them another way, a more radical way of actually dealing with social problems, and it's a particular form of Islam. So that is something that is a trend that we're seeing happening, and certainly in the area where I live, the local mosque, it's populated by our people, and also many Muslims who come directly from Africa. So the demographics of the Muslim community are shifting.
Wow.
And what we also saw is many of the so-called Muslim organizations and so forth, there was an initial kind of condemnation of these two young men and that this was un-Islamic and so forth, but there was hardly any black community representation. And in fact, PARCO, the Reparations coalition that I am a representative of, I believe that we issued, if not the first, the only community statement that actually sought to put this within a collective community political context. And we basically issued a statement calling for honest dialogue as to what it is that would drive young men to such levels of disaffection where they would feel compelled to take these acts. And it's important because even if we take at face value what we've seen on the news reports, and that's what we have to say because none of us were there to witness it directly, but some statements were made. Some political statements appear to have been made by one of the accused, Michael Adebolonjo, who made statements of a political nature indicating his involvement in the incident and why. And so whilst it's, I think, maybe appropriate to denounce the resort to direct violence simply because there is this notion, even in our struggle, of reactionary violence and revolutionary violence, and one would possibly argue that this was actually a reactionary violence. But if we are going to engage in any forms of violence at all, that it must be a revolutionary violence and it must be strategic and actually targeted. And this is in terms of defending one's, human rights. It's not being, an aggressor, but in terms of defending one's human and people's rights. But we cannot ignore the statements that were made by one of the accused who appeared to give a rationale for these actions. And it was like, well, you're messing up our countries back home. There was an apology. Sorry, women and children have to witness this, but where I come from, where our people come from, our women and children see this thing every day. And so a lot was inferred from that statement, that it was about, a critique of the, war in Iraq and also Britain's colonial expeditions all around the world. However, that statement equally applies to what's happening in Africa and many of the conflicts that are being fomented and the invasions that we're seeing on the continent of Africa. So in our statement as PARCO, we pointed out that violence occurs along a continuum of self-directed, direct, structural and cultural violence, and so we cannot reduce it to examining what appears to be an isolated incident thus far. And we spoke of, in these times of state-imposed austerity measures, which we know are provoking widespread everyday resistance, we recalled the admonition of Martin Luther King Jr. that the triple evils of poverty, racism and militarism are also forms of violence that exist in a vicious cycle, and they are interrelated. And so what we were basically saying is, let's look at the wider context of violence. It's not so much that these two young men are, perpetrated violence, but let's not isolate them from also the violence that you are perpetrating on a much bigger scale that really could be classified as terrorism in terms of the damage that is being done to, millions of people.
Absolutely. Just pointing out quickly for listeners, if you all remember 2011, Anders Breivik, the white male in Norway, he detonated some explosives and then he went and shot a bunch of people. I think he killed about 70 people. 2011, white people declared that was not an act of terrorism, if you remember, or I certainly remember.
These two men, they kill one man, as despicable as that may be, and it gets classified as terrorism. So it's also around who has the power to define. And in fact, we draw parallels with Assata Shakur being placed on the FBI's most wanted list in terms of terrorism, and this equation of the black liberation struggle with domestic terrorism and extremism. And so we are seeing this in a similar light, because either way, these two young men and many other men like them may be attracted to particular, more what's called political forms of Islam for specific reasons. It's because they are also trying to resist or protest in some way about the conditions not only in this country that they find themselves in, but also exposing the role of this government in their misadventures globally. And so that's something that we cannot lose sight of, the wider context of this incident and what that means.
Absolutely. Is the PARCO statement, and PARCO again, that's Pan-African Reparations Coalition in Europe, is your statement, is that available online for folks to?
Yes, it is. It's available online. It's actually on a website called Ghana News, I believe. They actually printed it. We also were calling for a parliamentary commission. So it wasn't just a statement that we were pointing out, well, hold on a minute, let's not just look at these two young men. We called for the establishment of a UK all-party parliamentary commission to really study the condition of black people of African origin in the UK in terms of linking this to legacies of enslavement and colonialism. Because what we were saying is that actually there's a whole constituency of this population that you are not recognized, that we have historical grievances, and that many of these grievances are also impacting on our contemporary lives. So that's what we have also been calling for from the British government. We have not had a response as yet, but that is something that we will certainly be lobbying at all levels of the British government, because we are saying that we need the right to a hearing. We need to have a community commission whereby members of our community can actually come and give evidence and testimony as to the reality of living in so-called modern-day multicultural Britain, to really assess, what kind of freedom, what kind of citizenship are we experiencing today when we have huge inequality that's still impacting on so-called British citizens. So we are being denied the benefits of full citizenship in this country, despite whatever our passports may say.
Absolutely. Want to see if co-host Justice, if she has any questions. Listeners, you can dial in as well. Number is 760-569-7676, and the code is 564-943#. Press *6 if you have questions. Phenomenal information today. I did want to point out for listeners, number one, I have not heard very many folks, really, I've only heard one other person point out that the suspects in the killing of Mr. Rigby, that these suspects, that they are victims of racism, and that experiencing that abuse and mistreatment as citizens of Britain and victims of racism, that might have led them to take this sort of stance and to do what they did. I only heard one other person say that. It was Dr. Usama Hassan. He was doing an interview on the BBC, and he said he's a non-white person. He said, I was a victim of racism. He didn't say victim of racism, but he did say that he experienced racism growing up. He said he was mistreated, and that it did push him to being more quote-unquote radical. And he said that the same thing might have happened for these suspects. That's the only other person that I heard say that.
Exactly, and there's another dimension to the story. I'm not sure if the listeners are aware, but we also know, because it's been extensively reported, that one of the accused in particular had been approached by MI5, secret services basically, to become an informer. And so that's why I'm saying there's a lot more to this story, that we still have to get the actual facts. And this isn't just these two young men. It's happening across the board, where we're hearing reports of especially young African men who come from overseas or who have connections overseas in terms of their family connections, being enticed to become informers with the secret services and to work undercover. So then that does bring up other questions as to what happens when you say no. Do you ever escape the watchful eye of the security forces, or do they seek to somehow pin something on you further down the line? And in fact, a friend of one of the accused went on a TV program on BBC Newsnight, and this young man is called Abu Nusayba, and he claims to be a friend of one of the accused Michaels. And what he said is that the same Michael Adebolajo had gone to a lawyer apparently to complain of harassment by the British Domestic Intelligence Service, the MI5, who were under lots of pressure at that time. So when we find that out, it should make us wonder what's really going on here. And linking it back to the racism, we know that the same Michael is supposed to have become radicalized as a result of experiencing some form of torture when he was overseas in Kenya. Now, we could say, that's Kenya, that's an African government. It was, our own people that actually abused him. And there was even talk of, physical abuse and even sexual abuse to some degree. So we can say, well, it's our own people, but what we do know is that he was released into the custody of the British intelligence agencies. So there's a lot more to this story, and it makes us think, well, if these young men, especially the main one, that's the one who's alleged to have killed Rigby, if what they were doing, and if they were such a threat, and if this was known to the intelligence services, why wasn't greater attempts made to prevent this from happening? So it's very, very clear that these young men, and at least one of them was being monitored and watched and under, a huge amount of surveillance, but yet this still was allowed to happen. I think we need to ask questions about that. And we need to not only ask the questions, we need to be rigorously trying to ascertain the answers. And that, I believe, is a process that will also take some time.
Absolutely. I just going to point out for listeners, just context, and for those patterns. Now, not that long ago, the Boston bombing in April, you had the same thing where the suspects, the Tsarnaev brothers, where they were on the radar, an intelligence community from a different country had already said, we have reason for concern that these folks might be involved in criminal activity, and this had already been presented to U.S. intelligence. They still allowed them to come into the country. So these folks had already been known, hey, this could be a problem. They allowed them to come in and they do some sort of quote-unquote and that was another one that they said was terrorist act. What gets labeled terrorism, what does not. But just noting those similarities to have these two events happen within about 30 days of each other, just I would say something to make note of. Exactly what she said. We should all be trying to get as much info as possible. But I did want to ask one other quick question. You pointed out earlier the almost absurdity of, in this event where you've allegedly got people being hacked to death or beheaded possibly in the middle of the street, and then you've got white women who are just walking up and holding conversation as though everything
quite
is fine.
Normally, like it's a walk in the park. I mean, it must be quite unprecedented. That's certainly quite strange. So yes, there's a lot of questions, and there's a lot that we still do not know, because a lot of the reporting has been so skewed. As we know, a lot of the news reporting is syndicated. So even to get the actual truth as to what occurred is probably going to take some time. There's also, if people have seen the footage, there's another curious kind of occurrence where, when you've allegedly got one of them walking about, with meat cleaver, whatever, machete in his hand, there's an old black woman just walking calmly with her shopping trolley, just walking straight by, and it's just surreal. It's just really surreal that people seem to be so calm when yet this is meant to be a gory, graphic, bloody affair, that would strike terror, I think, in anybody who was there at the time.
Hey, I just found this amazing. The white woman, or one of them, or I guess these two aspects are amazing if you have any thoughts. Number one, the women who went to help and to talk to the suspects, they have been labeled the Woolwich Angels.
Yeah.
That's one. And then two, one of them, her name is Ingrid Loya Kennett. She did a report. It's on theguardian.co.uk. You can listen to it. It's as a podcast. You can download it if you don't want to read it. It's titled, and I'm just reading what The Guardian has. It says, Woolwich attack witness, I feel like a fraud.
Yeah.
And then it goes on to, talk about her incident. But it is fascinating for so many reasons. Even one of them where this witness, one of the Woolwich Angels, quote unquote, where she says that she lived in New Zealand for a little while and racism was a big problem there. And to come back and the place where she lives, I guess they don't have a lot of non-white people. It's mostly white people in the part of England where she lives. And she was saying that, she was looking forward to the diversity and she couldn't believe that this happened. And it just, fascinating report if you want to check it out, where she says she feels like a fraud. Anything you wanted to get in on this, the Woolwich Angels?
Well, again, it's quite interesting because it does expose once again the deception that is really created about Britain, as though we're all happy here. There's no problems around racism in Britain, and it's this image that Britain portrays. I mean, it's unlike the U.S. where I think everyone knows there's problems there. There's racial problems there. Even though we're not in the U.S., we know this, but the same understanding and knowledge is not translated overseas in terms of what we as black people experience in Britain. So it's quite interesting, I would say, and ironic that she claims to sort of be so shocked and not realise that Britain was really like this, because if she just went into any of her local communities, she would see the racism. I mean, it's, you don't have to look very far, and it's unfortunate that it took an incident like this, such a tragic incident, and we say tragic because whether it was a false flag, whether these were two young men who were misguided and mixed up, it's still tragic because the actions that they took, they could have achieved bigger gains if they had taken different actions.
Context of white supremacy. We will see if Justice has any questions. Your line should be open. Perla, please proceed.
Can I be heard?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. Greetings to the guest. Hi, and the listeners and Gus. White people say that one of the suspects is a black person that tried to kill the two police officers. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, again, it's hard to have a comment on that because it could be argued this was self-defense. Certainly from some of the footage that I've looked at, the young man in particular was waiting calmly around, appearing to be explaining his actions, and then the police came and it looked as though he was running to charge at the officers. That doesn't mean that he was attempting to kill them. We don't know what he would have done because basically both of them were shot. So that's, again, I think an attempt to create this sense of moral panic and fear and dread in the wider population to think, well, yes, this was well justified. It's also interesting that these young men were not killed. I'm not advocating that they should have been. They were shot and they were injured. So they were left to live, basically, to tell the tale.
Mark Duggan.
Right. And we know that that's not necessarily the typical experience. We've got a huge amount of deaths in custody where for less than this, people have been killed. So there seems to be some contradictions and some inconsistencies around the behavior. I mean, if these two men, where they were striking terror in people, meant to be hacking off heads and doing all kinds of things, but yet, yes, they were shot in a way that they would have been left to live. And so now questions for us, certainly in the legal community, there are questions around what kind of trial process, what kind of investigation, what access to justice will these two men really have? And has there already been a trial by media? And we would advocate that there has been a trial by media.
Do you think white people are making the story up?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Do you think white people are making the story up?
I'm still not getting the question. If white people are making the
story about
if they're getting it.
I'm sorry?
Are you asking me if white people are getting the story?
Fabricating?
Maybe you need to, if you can rephrase the question.
Do you think white people are making the story, the story meaning the white person that got killed, and the
Rigby.
Okay. Have any white people directly told you they don't want you here, you're a black person, just go?
No, I personally have not experienced that. However, I know people that have. I know that direct racism, overt racism, is increasing towards black people who would have considered themselves to have been very much settled in this country. Because, see, oftentimes a lot of white people, they can tell the difference between black people who've lived here a long time, been born here, and those communities who come from, Africa or the Caribbean or anywhere else in the black world, who are new arrivals. Yeah, and they can tell the difference, because a lot of the time in inner city areas there will be mixing of the various groups coming together. But what we are experiencing is many people who would have considered themselves to be well settled in this country and therefore not foreign are actually being targeted. And this is increasing. This direct racism is increasing. There's been incidents on the public transportation system. I know somebody who even put something on YouTube where he was just on the train and was being harassed and verbally assaulted by a white woman who was, basically just calling all of the black men terrorists and to go back to the jungle, go back to Africa, go back to mud huts and this sense of kind of terror that you young black men who are the thugs on the street that we have to pass every day have the potential to actually now want to hack us all to bits. So it's quite a precarious situation for, I'd say, young men in particular. And also for not only young men, but women who are Muslim, who actually wear the hijab. There's been a lot, or any kind of covering, face covering or head covering. There's been a lot of kind of verbal and in some cases physical assaults. It's not only about people who look Muslim, it's about anybody who looks different or foreign, meaning non-white.
Have you ever been called a nigger?
Yes, I have, but not too often, I have to say. Not too often. I think that I cannot, it's been years and years and years that I've actually been called a nigger.
Okay, do you remember how you felt?
Yes, when I was called a nigger, I guess I felt dismayed, really, as to why I would be called a nigger, because it was actually by a young person, and it was a very ignorant thing to say. But for me, that's not what I would focus on. I think the wider experience of the more subtle form of racism is far more challenging to me, because they might not call you nigger. However, there are other ways in which they're basically saying the same thing. and it gets dressed up in pretty English language and in lovely words, but the actual impact and the meaning is the same. So I feel that's what we need to focus on a lot more, because it's not being so much called a nigger. In the UK, they would use terms, the nigger term is being used a lot more now because of its, I think, prevalence in various forms of popular culture. But a more common term would be black bastard, black bitch, something like that. So that's quite standard, that's quite common for a lot of people in this country. And it's just something that one hears often. However, whilst those words may be offensive, depending on how they're used, I feel we need to pay much greater attention to the everyday, calling us of niggers without using the term nigger, and the belittling and the demeaning and the making small and the attempt to deny our humanity, because that's actually far more damaging and devastating when you have grown men and grown women being spoken to as though they're little children, and that happens a lot in the workplaces. You often hear reports of racial discrimination at work, where you'll have an experienced staff member who's black, and then they're being managed or spoken down, talked down to by perhaps somebody who's just joined the team, somebody half their age, half their experience, and I think that in itself is quite demeaning. The racial microaggressions, the everyday slurs, slants, and jibes that we kind of have that are really designed to belittle us and to make us feel small and make us feel inadequate and less than.
Do you remember what you did about it?
I believe I think I actually just responded, just told them to shut up or something like that, and just dismissed it and walked away. And that's how I dealt with it. Yeah, because I just dismissed it, to be quite honest with you. It's not something I paid a huge amount of attention to.
Okay. What was the situation?
I was just walking down the street, and I was called this. I was just walking down the street, minding my own business. I think I was going to the park. And so I was walking in the sort of pathway along the pavement with a young white male, and he just decided to make a derogatory comment towards me. But it's happened very few times, so in that overt way, it's happened very few times. But that doesn't mean I haven't experienced racism. But that's why I was emphasizing the broader context of racism, because I've experienced a lot more of the subtle form of racism, which is just beneath the radar. They don't say anything too overt to be exposed, but you know what they're saying, because there's ways of saying things without actually using the direct words.
Did you say earlier that in Britain Asians are classified as black?
Well, some of them classify themselves as black still. Those who are probably of what they call the political definition of black, although the terminology in the kind of more mainstream, not-for-profit sector, as you would call it, is black and Asian. So you'll hear the term black and Asian or black minority ethnic, and the Asians like to kind of assert the Asianness. However, there are still many Asian people who will define themselves as black. And it gets used actually as a term that means all minorities or all non-whites. So in the not-for-profit sector, the government-funded sector, although there's less government funding these days for this kind of community work, the term black is used in areas, especially outside the big cities, where they don't have big populations of black and so-called minority ethnic communities or other racialized groups. They just lump us all together, and you know, they'll call us all black. So you'll have like black networks, community networks, and so forth. But when you go there, you'll find people of all descriptions and all nations: Vietnamese, Chinese, you name it, Iraqi. Then sometimes they get classified as black.
How do you think white people classify who is white, who is not white, or who is black?
You know, interestingly enough, a lot of white people, they don't actually classify themselves as white because they're the norm. So I do a lot of training, in particular with mental health professionals, and in particular I run a course which is a sort of equalities course around racial justice, and I have trained white professionals, and part of what I explore with them is white racial identity and white privilege, and many of them really are aghast when I bring this up because they've never really had the space to explore their white identity. And so oftentimes they'll just say, well, I'm just a woman, or I'm just a man, or I'm from up north, or what have you. Whiteness, they don't claim as an identity. But when I go through the training with them and create that space, and I go through various theories around white racial identity development, that's when they kind of begin to sort of assert it or recognize it. But initially, there is often an attempt to deny whiteness and deny the power of whiteness and white supremacy as a system. In terms of how they see us, they just define us a lot of the time on the basis of our skin color, and sometimes, you know, other kind of physical features. That's how they would define us. But they don't necessarily always have clarity, because we all, for some white people, I can't really generalize to all, but for some white people, then they will just lump us all together. They don't recognize distinctions within our group. And the way in which I say this is because through a lot of government policy, you will find in the not-for-profit sector, they use the term in Britain BME, which stands for Black Minority Ethnic. And in fact, they won't use the full description, Black Minority Ethnic. You'll hear about BME services, BME elders, BME this, BME that, BME children, and then, you know, I'm always asking, well, what's a BME? I'm not a BME. You know, you can't classify me as a BME, but even many of our own people, we have accepted this terminology. Why? Because it's what a lot of government policy frameworks recognize. It's what a lot of local authorities recognize in terms of funding provisions. So what we see is the attempt to shape us and lump us all together structurally, and many of us actually, you know, are responsible, I'd say, for continuing that or allowing that to happen rather than asserting a positive racial identity. Now, there's a difference between a BME and a black, because BME is depoliticized, it's ahistorical, whereas the term black is not ahistorical. There is still this notion of black power, a black liberation movement. So the concept of black has been turned into something positive throughout our kind of, you know, recent history of kind of civil rights organizing, whereas the term BME doesn't actually carry any of that historical agency and, you know, the struggle against oppression and racial discrimination and our dehumanization in this society.
Thank you, Ms. Xosei, for answering my questions. Gus, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you.
One of our listeners dialed in with a question. I'll give out the number again if other folks have questions. 760-569-7676, and the code is 564-943#. Press star 6 if you have questions for Mrs. Esther Stanford Xosei. Caller at 5301. Your line should be open.
Good afternoon. Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Good afternoon to the guests.
Greetings.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Greetings. I have a question. When you look at African people and people of African descent throughout the diaspora, whether they are in Britain, here in the States, or other places, they seem to disproportionately choose either Christianity or Islam for their faith perspective. And considering that both of the colonizers and enslavers from all of the European countries and even the Arabs, so-called Arabs, practice those religions, do you think that we could truly ever be liberated as long as we continue to identify ourselves with the religions of people who conquered us?
I guess in short, I would say no. I would say I don't think we can truly be liberated in terms of the spiritual emancipation, as it were. However, I think I'd have to give a staged answer to that in terms of the process, because I do also acknowledge that the question of religion and faith and belief and identity is quite complex with our people. So we also know that throughout history there has been liberation, what they call liberation theology. There's been liberation theology tendencies even within some of these wider religions, if you like. Now, I'm a bit loath to use the term religion, because when we actually go down and examine people's practices, then they can't just be classified as religious. There's a lot of our culture that gets infused, even when you have someone that will say, I'm a Christian or I'm a Muslim. In terms of what their practice is, it's not necessarily the same as the standard European or so-called Arab Muslim. And so I feel that we need to have a much more deeper look at questions of belief and identity. But I do accept, as a short answer, that we cannot fully be totally liberated in terms of our minds and our psyches as long as we are still embracing Eurocentric interpretations of the divine and the creative force, however we call that creative force.
So, thank you for your answer. So, I'm just thinking of the black people here in the States, and my own family members, and it seems to be a pattern that many may begin growing up in a household that might be Christian, and at some point in their lives they become dissatisfied with that, and they take on some form of Islam.
Yeah.
And then at some point, many oftentimes become dissatisfied with that, and may take up what is considered an indigenous African spiritual system.
Right. Yeah.
Whether it be Yoruba or any other particular belief system. But why do you think it is that we continuously go through that sort of pattern where we start with either Christianity or Islam And it takes so much of our lives for us to get to a point in which we want to consider looking at our lives and living our lives.
Yeah, part of it is because it's been institutionalized. It's been institutionalized through colonialism. So we know that Christianity was not just institutionalized as a religion, it was institutionalized throughout the social system. And you could say similar things, you know, with Islam and how it was originally institutionalized in Africa. So that's why I guess it takes so long for our people to find our way to trying to explore, okay, what came before now, Christianity or Islam? What was our way of doing things? I do feel, however, that it's not, the simple answer is not just, because there's a debate that we have in the UK too, which is probably similar to the States. We need to kind of get rid of these foreign religions and we need to go back to an indigenous, or what some people would say, African spirituality or what have you. And I feel that's only part of the answer, because essentially when I examine why our people gravitate to a lot of these so-called religions, especially Christianity or even Islam, it's not so much the spirituality of these belief systems. What they're gravitating towards is a sense of community, a lot of the time, a sense of institutional resources and power. So a structural power base that they can tap into that might appear to meet some of their everyday needs. So you'll hear a lot of people saying, oh, in my church we've got this. If I need something done, there's a brother here or a sister there. And what I've seen around indigenous, you know, so-called indigenous religion or African spiritual systems is we haven't been able to institutionalize our spiritual systems in the same way and to be able to meet the everyday needs of our people, you know, the basic needs that people need to survive. We have not been able to do that in a systematic way. So that's why I'm saying it's quite a complex picture, because even when you have people that will say they're Christian, if something goes wrong and the Bible scriptures are not doing it, guess what? They're going to look for somebody who's an indigenous practitioner, and they're doing other stuff. So what we have is a lot of syncretism, and it's really hard then to kind of be able to separate or even delineate which aspect it is that people are really gravitating towards. So I think it's quite a complex picture. And we also have to look at the critique, you know, or the elimination, I think, of the weaknesses that we've also seen manifested in some of our indigenous forms of belief, whereby we are not able to just address everyday collective needs. It's fine on an individual, whereby people, depending on what they do, whether it's libation, veneration, the ancestors, our own kind of everyday things we can do in our own houses, our own families, but how does that improve the well-being and the welfare of the group? And I feel that's the kind of conversation that we need to be having. And unfortunately, a lot of our people are gravitating to these other religious systems because they feel, or at a certain basic level, they're getting more of those everyday needs met. Whether it's a sense of belonging, a sense of community, a sense of fellowship, where there are people who can assist, who can actually be each other's keeper. I don't think we've kind of done so well in recent times of doing that around in terms of indigenous belief systems and African spirituality.
Thank you. I would definitely agree with that because, I grew up in Islam and, had my bouts of Christianity and all that other stuff. And for the most part, I would go to a church or go to a mosque for the sense of community, although I had serious issues with the doctrine.
Right.
For me, it became my spiritual practice at home was what it was. But going to these different communities, if I participated because maybe they did some community-based outreach efforts or things of that nature, or maybe I like the men's fellowship or things of that nature. But I think that we just need to do a lot better in terms of things that are African-centered, because, you know, it's great to have lectures and workshops and seminars, but, you know, oftentimes when you think from an African-centered perspective in terms of community, from spirituality, there aren't a lot of resources, with the exception of maybe Dr. Ray Hagan, African Village, and a few others that are talking about spirituality from an African-centered perspective. But I thank you for your answer.
Thank you.
Context of white supremacy. I wanted to make sure we discussed the recent ruling about compensation for victims in Kenya. But I had a few other quick points I wanted to touch on with the Woolwich tragedy. Number one, Tommy Robinson, racist suspect, the English Defense League, they have been very active. They had been active prior to all this, but it seems they've been even more active, marching, protesting, that sort of thing, making interviews, television appearances. Even though, and again, Akala, he made a great point of saying that really this is rubbish. Like when you think of racism, white supremacy, you are confused if you think EDL, because that is a really weak, almost clownish aspect of racism. You want to think the people that are responsible for why no one was arrested for the murder of Stephen Lawrence for almost 20 years, that's just the regular old white people who are not out in the street jumping up and down talking about we don't want any more niggers here or whatever. That's just regular old white people with a suit on who go to work calmly, that are not acting a fool on the bus, calling people apes and monkeys. He made a great point of making that distinction. However, Stephen Lawrence, just because Doreen Lawrence has been a guest on this program twice, and I have so much respect for the work that she has done, and just being a soldier. When I think of a soldier, I think of Doreen Lawrence. She is just a soldier. Getting up, you go do your work every day. I do think it's important, because you said there's been an increase, and if you've got black people now as being the face of terrorism, if groups like the Golden Dawn and the English Defense League, if they're more active, that is not something that's totally harmless, because that can result in more Stephen Lawrences. Could you speak to that?
Oh, definitely. It's not to say that we shouldn't tackle it or so forth, but there's a problem in Britain in that anti-racism, if you like, has become synonymous with tackling far-right groups. It doesn't really exist outside of that context, and I think that's why it's problematic. So people only want to recognise racism if it's the British National Party and somebody who's coming across obviously like a clown and not making no rational sense. Those are the easy people to highlight as being racists. But the everyday racism, which is the subtle racism, the structural racism, the systemic racism, is what has become invisible now. And in fact, we're seeing more cases of, even when we try and even have the conversation about different experiences, different life experiences, different experiences of citizenship, different levels of inequality, that conversation is also being muted. It's being shut down. So it's we're actually seeing the reverse, whereby to assert racial difference and the right to an identity and the right to basically not become part of a melting pot and assimilate into Anglo-Saxon whatever, that is being classified as being racist. So when you have people, let's just say, if I wanted to run a youth project, I live in an area where predominantly the young people will be black people of African Caribbean origin, and there are specific issues that population group will experience. I'm a youth worker, a community worker, and I want to develop a project that's trying to target some, early prevention or whatever, trying to meet their specific needs. That in itself is being classified as racist, because it's not mixing, it's not allowing, it's not cohesion, because there's a policy around community cohesion, which is where we all have to just come together and we all have to mix all the time. But it's an artificial mixing, because the basis of the mixing is that we deny difference, we deny different experiences, and that we all pretend as though we're all living the same reality and we have the same experiences, which is not true. So you have many young black people today who feel asserting their own identity is racist. Speaking out against white racism is racist. So there's a lot of confusion now, identity confusion, and confusion around what racism or white supremacy. I mean, in the UK, white supremacy is not the everyday language that gets used. White supremacy is identified with far-right groups like the Ku Klux Klan, the EDL, the English Defence League, and the British National Party. That's white supremacists. So most Caucasians are not that. So they're not racist. So that's the problem we have.
You pointed out, and I thought this was really important because we've talked about this issue a lot. I recently, I took some criticism, people saying that I was spreading confusion. I was adding to the confusion that you just spoke of by using the term non-black, non-white. And making a distinction between saying, yes, we have a system of white supremacy that mistreats everyone who is not white. That's true worldwide. However, I'd make a distinction between black people and non-black, non-white people, because I think white people make a distinction between those groups, and I think white people treat black people worse. And I took some criticism, people saying that they didn't think that was true, and that they think it would be best if we just look at all non-white people the same. And I think they would say the same thing to you, like when you consistently have to specify that you're talking about black people of Caribbean and African descent.
Yeah, I mean, exactly, because I would probably get the same criticism, but to me it's absurd, because there is a recognition that white supremacy doesn't affect groups in the same way. So we have to look at the specificities of white supremacy as it impacts on a black person of African origin, a black person of African Caribbean origin, a person who would describe as being Asian, a person who would describe themselves as being Arab or whatever. We have to look at the different nuances within the white supremacy. And to just lump us all together and think that, Islamophobia is not going to affect me in the same way because I'm not a Muslim. And so if that just wouldn't be the correct terminology or descriptor. In the UK, we use the term anti-black racism in the kind of movement, not everyday usage. And we also use the term Afrophobia, which is anti-African prejudice and discrimination, which is a specific form of anti-black racism, because there is a recognition that not all black communities are African, in that, there will be people who are, say, Aborigine who might define themselves as black, but wouldn't define themselves as African. So I do feel we need to recognize the distinctions. But that's not necessarily to say the same thing as creating a hierarchy of oppression, but we do need to recognize the different ways in which we are oppressed.
I completely agree. I guess I could be, that label or that critique could apply to me as well, because I do think, unfortunately, that darker people, individuals that are labeled as black, I do think that they're treated worse worldwide. Yeah. Do you think that's accurate, or is that the same thing?
Well, yeah, there is there's still a sort of pecking order, a hierarchy, where the closer to white you are, means that not to say you won't experience racism, but it will be a different type. So I would agree with you. And I do feel that anti-black is really the basis of all of it, and it's really how close to the black are you and how close to the white are you? And that's really what determines what it is. So in the UK, you'll get a lot more of the terminology black and brown. So the Asian people, and South Asians in particular, will call themselves brown people. They're not so much calling themselves even black anymore. So there are these subtle distinctions. And if we need to do that as well, because there's also the intergroup discrimination. So just because we might all be victims of white supremacy, that doesn't mean that an Asian person's not going to look at me and have negative or pejorative attitudes about who I am.
I unfortunately agree, and white people are most to blame for all of that. I make sure to keep that in mind as well, that we have been wronged, but I just think that we need to point out those distinctions and how we have been wronged. I guess last quick note on the Woolwich situation, so much great information. You said that even, regardless if what we have been told, if it's true, if it's false, whatever, at the end of the day, this incident is going to be used by racist white supremacists for their agenda. One thing that I saw, and this for folks in the States at least who are aware of everything that's been going on, talk about spying and checking your phone records and data collection. In the UK, they just had big public debate about a communications data bill.
That's right.
That did not pass. The people got really upset. It did not pass. This event happened where now you got the black face of terrorism in the UK, and you've got politicians saying that, maybe we need to revive the communications data bill. Could you comment on that?
No, you're absolutely correct. So it's commonly, colloquially, called the Snoopers Charter, which is really a bill that they've been trying to pass that is very, very repressive and definitely takes away a lot of our privacy and our freedoms. And by actually being able to log and monitor every email, every communication, every data search we do on the internet and so forth. So at the same time, we are seeing this Woolwich incident being used as an excuse to pass a piece of draconian legislation that will have a huge impact on citizens in this country, not just black people. So that is very, very problematic. And we're seeing an increasingly conservative environment where even our rights to express ourselves, our freedom of speech is being denied. And so we're living in a culture and a time where, public expression on the internet and Facebook and Twitter and all these kind of social networking sites is encouraged. But after the Woolwich incident, I know of a case of a young woman who made an ill-advised comment on the internet after the death of Lee Rigby, an ill-advised comment, basically, alleging something like, words to the effect of, if somebody's wearing a Help the Heroes T-shirt, which is the T-shirt that the soldier was supposed to be wearing, then they deserve to have this happen to them. Very ill-advised comment, very stupid comment, and it was said probably flippantly without a recognition or understanding of the consequences of that comment. That young lady was subsequently arrested and prosecuted, I believe, for malicious communication. So there's a lot of that happening as well. I mean, that's quite an extreme case, but we do know of other cases where even to provide a critique or to comment in terms of one's right to free speech and to freedom of expression and freedom of thought and freedom of belief, even that is actually being curtailed now because there's a thought police out there. And this legislation that you've mentioned that they're trying to pass is going to make it a much more, unsafe and repressive environment for us to be able to express ourselves. And when you are a people who are outside of the polity and outside of the benefits of citizenship anyway, in that you are treated as being second and in many cases third-class citizens, is very problematic, because one of the rights that we do have is the right to freely express ourselves and to be able to conceptualize and to dream and to vision alternative realities beyond what it is that we've been told we should accept. So I think this attempt now to use the Woolwich incident as a way of, again, creating fear in the wider British public, because to make them feel that somehow if this legislation had been in place, this incident would have been averted, I think that's ludicrous. And members of the MI5, I think, apparently even said that even if legislation had been in place, this incident would not have been able to have been averted. So, yeah.
Person that dialed in, last four digits, 1922. Did you have a question for Mrs. Esther Stanford Xosei?
Greetings, Gus. Greetings to your guest, Esther Stanford. I do have a couple of questions. I think one of them you might already answered. I was going to ask if the attack that happened at Woolwich, how was it going to impact immigration in the UK? You might have touched on that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean it's not. I mean, I think, in short, it will have some impact, but there's already been kind of anti-immigrant sentiments and immigration sentiments with this coalition government that we have. So I feel it will only be exacerbated now by the Woolwich incident. It's not going to create any new backlash, because the backlash has already been happening.
Okay. I've also seen some videos on YouTube stating that the attack that happened is a hoax.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I did begin the show pointing out some of this information as well. I am keeping an open mind at this stage, because I do not have full information. I'm sure some people do, but the wider public as yet does not have full information. So as I said, I'm keeping an open mind about the possibility of this being a false flag incident, but that doesn't, I'm not necessarily denying that this incident occurred. What I'm open to hearing more about and establishing more is really who is behind this incident. However, that doesn't take away from the fact that whether or not this was a false flag incident or not, that we need to be vigilant in our communities. We need to have a community response. We need to have a political response, because whether this incident was a false flag or not, it is going to be used now to actually target all of us. And so we can't just sit back and talk about conspiracy theories and do nothing whilst our rights are being taken away and, the carpet is literally being swept from under our feet in terms of violations of our human rights and our civil rights. And we're seeing that in terms of a much more conservative, a much more far-right environment, which is, more difficult to operate in for all of us, and a much more repressive environment. And part of how I believe we tackle that is it's about challenging the British government. It's challenging the British government to actually create space for us to investigate the true causes of this incident. not the causes they're telling us. They're attributing it to terrorism, but we want to have a full investigation of the facts of this situation and why it is two young people who, quote unquote, even of African origin, would still be classified as British, why they would have, been compelled to feel that this was the best way forward in terms of making this their point. So we do need to have an investigation. We need to have a true, investigation of the facts and the wider circumstances. What is the reality for people of, African origin, African Caribbean origin, so-called black people? What is our reality in Britain? What is our citizenship? How are our rights being violated today? And what impact is this causing, which has led to this unfortunate circumstance where two young men now are going to have to answer for the killing of this British soldier, Lee Rigby?
I have another question. I wanted to know how has the Prime Minister of the UK reacted since this incident? Has he said anything that you would consider to be racist or?
Well, I mean, I think one of the key statements that I remember was that this was an attack on the British people and the British way of life, and even classifying this as terrorism, I think, is hugely problematic and has huge racial connotations, because again it's actually promoting this notion of domestic terrorism when what we had was the killing of one soldier. As tragic as that was, we also can sort of juxtapose that with the killing of another so-called British soldier who happened to be black, Christopher Older. And this was, a state-sanctioned killing in terms of a death in custody, but yet a totally different reaction. So certainly the whole context of the Woolwich incident is a highly racialized context. It's a highly racialized conversation. The media reporting has been highly racialized. And so that in itself is creating, an exacerbation of direct, overt racist attacks, not just of so-called Muslim communities, but also of black communities and people who are not white. So that's the impact that it's having.
I got another question.
Hang tight 1 second, because we did have another caller with a question. No worries. If we have time, I'll see if we can come back to get your other question. LBM, did you have a question?
Gus?
Yes, ma'am. We can hear you.
Okay. I don't have my microphone today. So am I clear?
Crystal clear.
Okay, great. Miss Esther, welcome back to the program. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you.
I was a little sickened when you said that British female told the African brothers to go back to Africa.
Yeah.
Because I was recently in West Africa, and it was very alarming, the boldness with which these British females and other European females were going after these young African males and sexually exploiting these young males, exploiting their poverty. And so I'm wondering if there in the UK, is there still a significant number of black folk in the UK, particularly males, who are exempting white females from being the racists on the same level as males?
Yes, because the conversation around race, white females escape, actually, the analysis of being racist. And what we see is that a lot of our men are actually in relationships with these women. So that's what we have, a huge amount of interracial relationships. And I think that the statistic is something like 55% of black men, black African Caribbean men, are in relationships with white and other women. So obviously, for a lot of these men, the women are not seen as being actually perpetrators of racism, even though a lot of the time, in many of these relationships, there are quite clearly they've come together on a racialized basis, because once the relationship breaks down, then you often hear the insults that get traded between the two people, and unfortunately, most of the time when the relationship breaks down, the man is not around, and if the woman has a child, then the children have to grow up with being called a black this and a black that, and many children of so-called dual heritage talk about this, that their white parents, were also called them offensive names and wanted to throw the fact that their black dad and so useless dad or whatever else they wanted to call him. Unfortunately, racism is still very much seen as being either invisible in terms of perpetrators, or it's a masculine thing. It's the white male that we need to be worried about. The white female has been able to escape a real, I think, stringent analysis of the role historically and also in modern day times. And I used to work in a women's organization that was actually a feminist organization. The National Women's Organization in the UK was led by white women, and I experienced terrible racism in that organization for even daring to raise the conversation about race, which resulted in me taking an employment tribunal case out against my former employer. So it's a huge problem, and in fact, I was accused of being divisive for daring to suggest that for women who are not white, we are not only concerned with sexism and gender-based oppression, but we are also concerned with racism and other forms of oppression. But that was considered to be divisive, and I was victimized by white females to a very, 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 it was brutal, horrible. And psychologically, I was not prepared for that, because the whole discourse was around women are oppressed, and men, certainly in that environment, the violence against women. But what was not recognized was the violence that these women themselves were perpetrators of, even in terms of the psychological violence and the bullying amongst that group of women.
Right. Thank you for that. Gus, may I ask one more question?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. Esther, here in the U.S., we're still in the midst of a crisis of formal education, whereas throughout the so-called inner cities, many of our children their schools are being closed down. So I was wondering, what is the state of public education for black children there in the UK? And also, in terms of universities, we have a situation here where, even a lot of people that are going to college, going to university, getting degrees, are still not able to get employment. Are you having that same issue there?
We have the same problem here. Literally, it's happening on a smaller scale because we are smaller in number in terms of demographics than you are in the US, but it's the same phenomena. And in fact, some statistics came out the last year and a half that was saying young men in particular, young black men, who were, and these are not people who don't have an education, but they are, there's an unemployment rate of nearly 50%. For young men in between, say, 18 and around 35. So that's abysmal. We also have similar statistics as well for black women, depending on her so-called social class. So there is one statistic where it's perceived that black women are doing okay, and that they're getting the jobs above black men. But what we're also seeing is that many black women who were working in the system and in the mainstream, they're now losing their jobs too, and being got rid of. So we're seeing that. Around the education system, we're seeing the same thing too. The public education system is not fit for purpose, especially our children, but then I guess a critique would be made that it's actually only there to serve the elite, so it's not fit for anybody who's considered to be an ordinary person. But we are particularly disadvantaged because the system wasn't designed with us in mind. And so there's a big movement around trying to have, more inclusion, as they call it, within the curriculum, not just in Black History Month, which is for us is in October, not just in history as a discipline where it's talking about slavery. So we have a huge issue around educational content. What we've also seen since the coalition government came into power, that some of the space that was already there in the curriculum for teachers to be creative and, if you like, promote inclusion of our people across the disciplines, that's being narrowed. So there's increasing conservatism in the curriculum where teachers are being told they cannot teach what they used to be able to teach before, which would have been more fair and more just. We have huge rates, or I'd say disproportionate rates of school exclusions with our children. A lot of the time, the children that tend to get excluded are the ones that are least likely to sit there and just be indoctrinated. So they're the ones that get classified as naughty and as bad and as troublesome, and often end up probably getting themselves into a little bit of trouble because they are not being stimulated. They're not being edified with the curriculum that they're being taught. And so we're also having a conversation in the UK around redefining what we consider success to be, because oftentimes we hold up those children who pass their exams, but if we really examine what we're holding up to be success, really it's success within Eurocentrism. It's those children who are most able to become or allow themselves to be indoctrinated, and the ones that tend not to want to be indoctrinated and question and challenge the teacher when they're being told something that just doesn't make sense or is not correct, those are the ones that get penalized.
Is there any significant movement towards
Hang on one second. We have one other person that called in with a question. I wanted to make sure we got him. Our caller in the UK, someone in Miss Stanford Xosei's part of the world. Machiavelli, your line should be open. Caller in the UK, your line should be open. Machiavelli, are you with us? Not hearing anything. Not sure if you hit your mute button or if there's a problem with the line.
Am I coming through now, Gus?
Oh, okay, we can hear you. Yes, sir, we can hear you.
Greetings, Gus. Long time.
Good to hear from you.
Hello, Miss. Yes, you too, sir. Hello, Miss Xosei.
Hello, greetings.
Hiya. Couple questions. I just wanted to get a quick one in. I apologise due to technical difficulties. I've just managed to get on the line now. Skype was not letting me get through, so I missed everything that's come before. But I was Gus posted a video of yours, and you're talking about reparations. I didn't get a chance to fully watch the video, but I did have a question. Do you think that the recent case of the UK paying reparations to Kenya, does that affect or set a precedent for what you're doing at the moment?
No, not really, no. And the reason why is because that case was a very limited case in the way it was constructed and the way in which it was settled. It was a claim for reparations, but not for slavery and colonialism and its legacies, which is the movement that I'm part of. This was a case of reparations for personal injury as a result of originally five claimants, and then two of them subsequently died. So in law, if I smack you around the face and assault you, you are entitled to a reparation. So in that sense, it was a very narrowly constructed reparations case. The public recording and reporting of the case put it within the context of this is about reparations, for colonialism, etc. But when you actually read the case pleadings, it was very limited to these three claimants, and the settlement that is now been arrived at is going to benefit, I think, 5,000 plus veterans, but they're only literally going to get about £2,600, £2,800 each. So in my view, that is not true reparation. That is a limited compensatory sum, but reparations is truly repairing the damage. And the wider context of the Mau Mau case is about land reform, it's about agrarian reform, it's about looking at who still owns the economy in Kenya, and it's a much more sort of systematic structural transformation. That would be true reparations. The problem, I mean, even though it's been heralded as a victory, it's only a partial victory in terms of the individuals concerned being able to get a little bit of change, because that's all it is when you think about what they've gone through. But the problem with the case is that what it does is it potentially prevents a bigger, more accurate, more transformatory case or challenge being waged now, because the government can say, we've done it, we've given you your justice, we've settled, you've agreed to a settlement on these terms, and that's it. Wash our hands of it now.
Yeah, well, I did think when I was reading about it at the time, like the 20 million was a very small sum considering...
Ridiculous.
People got
ridiculous. I mean, Kenya, like all other places in the world today, is an expensive country. So that 2,600 or whatever it is, that's nothing when you consider that a lot of these elders have got health problems. A lot of them are very impoverished. That's nothing. It's actually an insult. And many of the veterans are not happy because the way in which the settlement was done is what usually happens. You get a group that purports to be speaking on behalf of the rest, and they're the ones who are compliant with that way of doing things are the ones who benefit, but the masses don't really benefit. So many of them are actually complaining, and this settlement actually has the potential to create a lot of division, further division within Kenyan society.
Oh, I see. One other question to piggyback off what you were saying earlier about schooling for black children over here. How far, I'm going to answer. Is there an all-black school in England anywhere?
No, not a full-time school, but I know there's been various attempts to have such a school. I mean, we have our Saturday schools, and there are schools such as the Queen Mother More School, which is in South London, in Clapham, and they are trying to become a charter school. And there are other schools that are trying to do that, develop as charter schools so that they can develop their own curriculum and so forth. But up until this point, there hasn't been a black school that has got a truly independent curriculum. Although, I stand corrected, there is a Seventh-day Adventist school. I think it's called the John Loughborough School, but again, that's Seventh-day Adventist, and so it's still particular, even though I guess it would be more culturally competent than a lot of the mainstream schools. But we haven't as yet had a full-time black school that's been set up on those principles of, positive affirmation of our history and our culture, and across the curriculum. What you often find with these schools is that we have literally a black administration, and we might tweak some of the subject matters, say history or maybe some of the humanities or whatever, But in essence, we're still working with the mainstream curriculum that everyone else works with.
Right, so unfortunately I got cut off when you was giving your response.
Okay. but no, the short answer is no, not in terms of a true, authentic, what people would say, African-centered curriculum.
Do you think, how far away from something like that do you think we are currently?
Oh, that's hard to say, because I know there's various people who've been trying to develop these charter schools, but they bog us down in a lot of administration and bureaucracy. Now, if we were to just do it ourselves and come together collectively and assert our agency and be self-determining, I think that could happen, very quickly. So really, it's not so much about what the bureaucracy and the powers that be, the education authority, are doing. I feel our people need to engage in civil disobedience a lot more. And one of the areas of civil disobedience could be literally resisting the education system that we have, in the same way that children in South Africa protested against the Bantu education. In effect, we have a Bantu education in Britain. But we're trying to fight the battle going through conventional law, taking conventional approaches, playing by the rules of the system, and we're never going to win the battle that way. We have to think outside of the box. Civil disobedience. If we were to take our children out of schools, and collectively come together and demand, access to state resources, demand our human rights to education, demand the human rights of our children to have culturally competent education, I think we'd see a different thing, because other communities do it in Britain. We're the only ones that are not, because we're playing too safe. We're playing by the rules too much. We actually have to break the rules in order for the rules to become more fair, and that's been the history of our freedom struggle, our struggle around civil rights. We had to break existing laws in order to make the laws, at least accommodate us slightly more. And unfortunately, our people have become too comfortable, and we want to do everything according to the conventions and the norms.
You just kind of led me on to my next point I just wanted to make. Sorry to hog the line, Gus. On your, based on your interactions with our people over here and your personal experiences, do you see us moving forward or backwards at this point of time, collectively? Because I find it very hard to... I rarely meet anyone that's African-centered in any shape or form in the UK. It's very rare.
Yeah, I would say we're doing both. The masses, I think we're moving backwards, because even a lot of the gains that we won as a result of our civil rights struggle in the UK, a lot of those gains are being rolled back. We're losing lots of community buildings. We're losing lots of community infrastructure, which has really helped to keep us whole and some semblance of maintaining our identity and our sanity in this society. But at the same time, there is resistance. So where there's oppression, we know there's always going to be resistance. And one of the promising developments, I would say, that is taking place at this time is something called the National African People's Parliament, which is basically a group of us who are coming together to try and assert ourselves collectively as a people. Because we recognize that even though there's lots of pockets of good practice, we are not, we're not strong enough. We're not being effective because we're doing individual actions. And so the Parliament is an attempt to bring us together under one roof, really united around being able to advocate in the best interests of our communities, being able to represent the best interests of our communities. And so that's why I say largely it seems as though we're going backwards, but there is also the resistance, which is where many of us recognize now we have to come together, we have to unite, we have to do or we die. It's as simple as that.
And one last question. When I think forward to life in the UK, say in the next 25, 30 years, I can really feel or see that black people will truly be the minority, and the majority, so-called black people, will be black people with white parents, white parents. Yeah. And the effect that's going to have long term for black people in this country, like I'm just really worried about that long term, because.
No, you're absolutely right, because the demographics point to that even we won't be able, even now we can't really talk about a sense of community, because our community is so fractured. And yes, 30 years from now, the sense of what we call a black community will look very different to even what it is now, which is why we have to form community. We have to build community again. We have to make a way out of no way, since we can project what's going to happen. And if we just look at ourselves as being in the UK, that's where we're going to go wrong. If we look at ourselves, though, as being a global people and recognize that the community that we have to form and attach ourselves to is the global community, then we'll recognize that actually things are not as dire as they look. And it's not all of our people, it's the community of like-minded people that see where it is that we need to go, that are dissatisfied with the status quo, and the people who are prepared and courageous enough to not only bring about the change, but to also, shape that change in their own best interests.
Okay. Is the African Parliament online?
Yes, it is. The website is inapp.org.uk, the National African People's Parliament, which was born out of the commemoration of the 30th anniversary of the National Black People's Day of Action in 2011. And so this is the legacy now, where we recognise we have to have an institutional basis, an infrastructure now, to support the community building that we're talking about needs to happen in order to assert our right to belong, our right to exist first and foremost, which is all human beings' right. We all have a right to exist, and also to be a representative body for our people, not only within the UK but also internationally, because the problems that we face in the UK are not localized just to Britain. We'll find the same problems affect our people globally, and what we're seeking to do is create a platform where we can link with all the other movements and all the other progressive organizations that are trying to do constructive work, in advancing our people's human rights and our rights as a people, as a nation, which is something that we have to yet build. But it's a nation in formation that is global.
What is the address again?
INAP, which is INAPP, http://inapp.org.uk. So the National African People's Parliament is an interim, nationwide, independent, representative body whose aim is to protect, preserve and promote the best interests of African, which is meaning black people in the UK. And this is a national endeavour in the UK at this time, but we have international dimensions to it. And at the moment, there isn't anything like this in the world, because a lot of the time our people organise according to these modern-day nation-states that we find ourselves located in, whereas our vision in the National African People's Parliament is looking at nation globally, not nation UK.
Outstanding. I'm on the website now. They have great information. inapp.org.uk. International National African. Interim National.
The National African People's Parliament.
Right.
And I'm also serving at this time as one of the co-chairs of the Interim National Organising Committee, who is charged with establishing this Parliament. So we really have to come together and build principled unity around the issues, because we're all facing similar issues, not just within the UK but globally, and that's why I'm actually quite optimistic about the way forward, even as dire as things are, because this is just one initiative, and there are other initiatives that we know of that if we just start linking together, then we will have a different story, and we will make a different history, and that's what we're about. We're trying to make a different history than the history that has been predicted for us, because we have to remember we were never meant to survive, but we did.
Context of white supremacy. Again, our guest. Always a pleasure to have her on the program. Mrs. Esther Stanford Xosei. In fact, we have appreciated your visit so much. When you were with us the first time in May of 2012, you encouraged us to check out the work of Jonetta Rose Barras. Whatever happened to Daddy's Little Girl.
The impact of fatherlessness on black women.
She will be a guest on the program next week.
Okay, brilliant.
Yep, we were supposed to have her on before, but she had to assist a friend, so we had to reschedule. But we did not forget, and you were the genesis for that idea as well. So we are listening closely. It's always a pleasure to have you on the program. Just was a treat. I'm going to check out the website and see if I can get some of the other folks that are working with the National African People's Parliament, see if they would like to come visit. And I will email you if you know anyone connected with the Kenyan settlement. It would be wonderful to have them on the program. We have a local number that they can dial for Kenya as well. So
I can send you those emails, and also the link to who to speak to in the Parliament as well.
Oh, that would be fantastic. Outstanding. It is always a treasure to have you on the program. We will definitely be in touch. And I emailed you. I saw the interview that you did back in December when you were talking about the white supremacy in Israel and how the black people there were being degraded. And it was outstanding. We played the whole program, the whole segment that you did. We played the whole. It was about a half an hour on our Saturday program.
On Press TV, yes, that's right.
It was phenomenal job, as always. I mean, I expected outstanding work, and you delivered as usual. Thank you again for being a guest on the program, and we will look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Thank you so much for having me. All right, goodbye.
Enjoy your evening.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.
Bye. Good night.
Good night.
Context of white supremacy. We will be right back. 2 hours and roughly 40 minutes. We will be having racist suspect Ross Tuttle on the program, documentary filmmaker and freelance journalist, talking about the so-called Stop and Frisk program. New York specifically is what he's dealing with, but I think he's white. I think he's not ignorant. Anyway, tune in 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. I would hang out. Always good to have the international folks, but we have another program. I will just give a quick paragraph to sign us out. This is one of the reports from the interim National African People's Parliament. The website again, inap.org.uk, inapp.org.uk. They have a report on the Woolwich the Woolwich tragedy. It's titled The Woolwich Report, The Manifestation of Defects. This is written by Lorena Campbell, black female. Can you remember the last time someone told you to get out of town? Well, it happened to me last Friday, 24th of May, 2013. The white man told me to get out of town, did not use polite language. He used derogatory, racially offensive language to address me as he calmly walked past. And the adjective which he used to tell me to get out of town was sprinkled with invectives, i.e., curse words. The man looked menacing. His look and body language as he strode by reminded me of one of the hillbillies from the movie Deliverance. If you have not seen Deliverance, oh man. Burt Reynolds' classic. I felt threatened even though all this happened under the watchful eye of the police. Where was I? In Woolwich, London. close to the place where the soldier Lee Rigby's life was abruptly and horrifically ended this week by Michael Adebolajo and Michael Adebowale. She doesn't say suspects. I feel, I just feel that's incorrect to not have them listed as suspects. That's the professional way you're supposed to do it. At any rate, you can check out more. I want to continue to read. She has some interviews as well from black people. Just that alone, this incident, I think, and she had so much great to share. This incident and happening the same month as Assata Shakur being the first ever female on the FBI's terrorist most wanted list. Black people as the new face of terrorism. That is like anti-blackness. That's at least a 10 percentage point jump. I mean, I don't think in my lifetime I have heard black people as the face, like literally black people as the face of terrorism. That's definitely a new wrinkle, but that seems to be what it is. We'll be back in 2 hours, 40 minutes. Context of White Supremacy signing out. It has been time. Replace white supremacy with justice. Thanks for tuning in.
I'm a victim, brother.
You're a victim.
Yeah. I'm a victim of 400 years of conditioning.
Shut up.
The man has programmed my conditioning. Even my conditioning has been conditioned.